2,000 years ago, in a cave overlooking the Dead Sea, someone hid away a collection of scrolls they believed the world wasn't ready to lose. Not because they were beautiful, not because they were rare, but because they described something terrifying, a final generation, a last group of humans who would live through the ultimate test between light and darkness before everything came to a head. And here's the unsettling part. When you actually read what they wrote, when you strip away the ancient language and look at what they were really describing, it sounds less like ancient history and more like a headline from this morning. Corrupt leaders manipulating truth for power, a hidden force of deception working behind the scenes of every institution. Wealth and violence eroding the moral fabric of society. Sacred laws twisted to mean whatever the powerful need them to mean. If you're hearing this and thinking, wait, that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Scholars have been noticing the same thing for decades. Tonight, we're going through 7 specific warnings preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Warnings written by a community convinced they were living in the last days. And by the end, you'll understand why so many people, believers and skeptics alike, can't quite shake the feeling that these 2,000-year-old words are describing right now. Before we go further, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing the comments roll in. Sydney at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, London on a lunch break, all listening to the same ancient warnings at completely different moments. It's one of my favourite parts of doing this. And if you want to actually support the show, the best way is simple. Find us on Spotify, listen there. And if you're enjoying what you hear, leave a 5-star review. Links in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Also, if mysteries like this fascinate you, I put together a book covering 12 unexplained mysteries history still can't fully solve. It's available on the website, link in the description as well. Now, let's step into the desert, into that cave, and uncover warning number 1. Warning number 1 takes us straight into the heart of what scholars call the Damascus Document. And if you've never heard of it, that's understandable. It's not the kind of text that makes headlines. It doesn't have the dramatic apocalyptic imagery of something like Revelation. There are no beasts with 7 heads, no seas turning to blood. Instead, what you get is something far more unsettling in its own quiet way. A legal and moral rulebook for a community that genuinely believed they were living in the closing chapter of human history. The Damascus Document isn't a single scroll either. It's actually pieced together from multiple copies found both at Qumran, where the famous caves are, and earlier from a synagogue in Cairo back in the late 1800s, decades before anyone even knew Qumran existed. That's worth sitting with for a second. This text was already circulating, already being copied and preserved, long before the scrolls in the Dead Sea caves were discovered in 1947. 2 completely separate discoveries, centuries apart, both preserving fragments of the same document. That kind of endurance tells you something about how important this text was to the people who kept it alive. So what does it actually say? Well, buried within its legal instructions and community regulations, there's language that scholars have spent generations trying to fully unpack. Phrases referring to an era of wickedness, a period when God's judgment draws near, and a community that must remain faithful through what the text calls the last days. The Hebrew phrasing here is dense, layered, sometimes ambiguous in ways that have kept translators arguing for decades. But the core idea comes through clearly enough. The people writing and copying this document believed they were standing at the edge of something. Not just another difficult chapter in history, but potentially the final one. This wasn't unusual thinking for the time, by the way. The period surrounding the composition of the Dead Sea Scrolls, roughly between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE, was absolutely soaked in apocalyptic expectation. Jewish communities across the region were producing texts obsessed with cosmic conflict, divine timelines, and the sense that history itself was accelerating toward a climax. The Damascus Document fits into that broader pattern, but it does something the other texts often don't. It gets specific about behaviour. It doesn't just say the end is coming. It tells its readers exactly how to live because of it. That's what makes this document so different from typical end times literature. Most apocalyptic writing from this era is heavy on imagery and light on instruction. Visions of angels, cosmic battles, strange creatures, but very little practical guidance. The Damascus Document flips that entirely. It's mostly instruction, mostly practical, mostly concerned with how a community should organize itself, resolve disputes, handle property, and maintain purity. And then woven directly into all of that practical material, you get these sudden bursts of urgent end-time language. It's almost like reading a company handbook that occasionally stops to remind employees that the building is on fire. Scholars who've spent their careers studying this text point out that this combination isn't accidental. The community believed that how you behaved in ordinary daily life was directly connected to the cosmic drama unfolding around them. Every decision, every rule about how to treat a neighbour, how to conduct business, how to handle conflict, all of it mattered because they believed they were living through the final test. This wasn't abstract theology floating somewhere above daily life. It was intensely, almost obsessively practical. If the end truly was approaching, then every single choice carried weight it wouldn't carry in ordinary times. The document also introduces us to language about a new covenant, a renewed relationship between this community and God that stood in contrast to what they saw as a corrupted mainstream religious establishment. This is important context. The people preserving the Damascus Document didn't see themselves as just another Jewish community going about business as usual. They saw themselves as a remnant, a smaller faithful group set apart from a wider society they believed had gone badly astray. And that sense of separation, that conviction that they were the ones who truly understood what was happening while everyone else remained blind to it, shows up again and again throughout the text. There's a phrase that keeps surfacing in scholarly discussions of this document, sometimes translated as the Age of Wrath, other times rendered as the Era of Wickedness. The exact translation shifts depending on who you ask, and that ambiguity itself is worth pausing on. These aren't texts with tidy, universally agreed upon meanings. Hebrew scholars, historians, and theologians have debated the nuances of these phrases for generations, and there isn't a single definitive answer. What we can say with more confidence is that the language consistently points toward a specific theological framework. History divided into distinct periods, moving toward a climax, with the current era being described as uniquely dangerous, uniquely corrupt, uniquely close to some kind of reckoning. Now, before we go any further, I want to pause for a second and mention something. If you're the kind of person who gets pulled into mysteries like this, ancient texts hinting at hidden knowledge, warnings that seem to echo across centuries, I put together a book covering 12 unexplained mysteries that historians and researchers still haven't been able to fully crack. It's available on the website, links in the description if you want to check it out after this. Back to the Damascus Document. What's fascinating is how the text frames time itself. There's a real sense throughout that history isn't just moving forward randomly, but that it's structured, almost like chapters in a book that's approaching its final pages. The community believed they could interpret the signs of their own era through the lens of Scripture. That events happening around them, political instability, religious corruption, foreign occupation, were not random misfortunes but signals. Markers pointing toward the approaching conclusion of a divine plan set in motion long before they were born. This is where things start to get genuinely interesting for us today, because the specific language used to describe that final era isn't just vague doom and gloom. It's remarkably detailed when it comes to describing the kind of world that would exist right before judgment arrives. A world where truth becomes difficult to discern. A world where corruption spreads through institutions that people are supposed to trust. A world where the faithful remnant has to actively work to stay clear-eyed while everyone around them seems increasingly deceived. And that's really the heart of what makes the Damascus Document worth examining so closely tonight. It's not simply predicting an ending. It's describing the emotional and social texture of the time leading up to it. The confusion, the moral erosion, the sense that something has gone fundamentally wrong with how people relate to truth, to each other, to whatever they consider sacred. Whether you read this as ancient superstition or as something with genuine prophetic weight, the description itself is strikingly detailed enough that scholars keep coming back to it, detailed enough that ordinary readers keep finding themselves uncomfortably nodding along. But what exactly did they mean by the final generation? That phrase sounds simple until you start pulling it apart. To a modern reader, final generation usually means the last people who will ever live. The final chapter. No one coming after, but ancient Jewish texts often use words like generation, age, and latter days in ways that are much more flexible than that. A generation could mean a literal group of people living at the same time. It could mean a moral type of people. It could mean an era defined by a certain kind of behavior. Or it could mean the final phase of a much larger divine timetable. And that distinction matters because the Damascus Document may not be saying, you are the last human beings before the destruction of the world. It may be saying something even more immediate. You are the people living in the decisive generation, the generation that will be tested, the generation forced to choose sides, the generation in which the hidden corruption of society finally becomes impossible to ignore. Think about the way we use the word generation today. We say the greatest generation, Generation X, Generation Z. We don't mean every person born within a mathematically precise number of years. We mean a group shaped by a particular historical experience. War, technology, economic collapse, cultural change. Ancient writers could use the word in a similar way, only with much higher stakes. A generation was not just a demographic category, it was a spiritual condition. In the biblical tradition that shaped the Damascus Document, generation could carry a moral charge. There are righteous generations and crooked generations, generations that remember the covenant and generations that forget it. A generation could be judged not simply by when it lived, but by what it became. That is likely part of what makes the phrase so unsettling. The community behind the scrolls may have looked at the world around them and concluded that their age had developed a particular character. Not merely sinful, because every age could be called sinful, but deeply confused, religiously compromised, spiritually disoriented. They saw a society where people still observed traditions, still spoke the language of faith, still participated in public religious life, but where something essential had gone wrong underneath the surface. And from their perspective, that was the real danger. Open rebellion is obvious. You can see it. You know what it is. But corruption that wears the clothing of righteousness, corruption that quotes sacred law while bending it toward power and self-interest, that is much harder to recognize. So when they spoke about a final generation, they may have been describing a generation in which the dividing line became clear, not between people who had never heard the truth and people who had, but between people who claimed to know the truth and people who were actually willing to live by it. That sounds harsh, and it was meant to be. The Damascus community did not see history as a neutral sequence of events. They believed human beings were accountable participants in a cosmic story. Every age presented choices, every society could drift. But there would come a point when drifting became rebellion, when compromise became a system, and when people who wanted to remain faithful could no longer simply blend in and hope for the best. This is one reason the document puts so much emphasis on separation. Not necessarily separation in the sense of running away from every other human being, but separation in the sense of refusing to let the values of the wider world define you. The community had rules because rules created boundaries. Boundaries around food, worship, property, speech, marriage, ritual practice, discipline. To us, some of those regulations can feel extremely strict, and historians debate exactly how literally every rule was enforced. But the larger purpose is hard to miss. The group believed that if they did not build a wall around their way of life, the moral confusion outside would eventually enter through every opening. Picture a small community living under enormous political pressure. Judea had been ruled by foreign empires for centuries. First Babylon, then Persia, then Greek kingdoms, then Rome. Local elites changed, priestly leadership changed. Political alliances shifted. Armies came and went. Taxes rose. Violence was always close enough to affect ordinary life. In that kind of world, it would have been easy to believe that history was coming apart at the seams. But the people behind the Damascus Document were not just reacting to chaos. They were interpreting it. That is the key. They were looking at instability and asking what it revealed about the moral state of their age. Why were institutions failing? Why did leaders appear corrupt? Why did sacred teaching seem contested? Why did ordinary people seem vulnerable to deception? Their answer was not mainly political, it was theological. The world was out of order because people had abandoned the path they were supposed to walk. And this is where final generation becomes more than a date on a calendar. It becomes a warning about momentum. A society does not usually collapse morally in one dramatic afternoon. It happens in layers. First, a practice that once seemed shameful becomes tolerated. Then it becomes ordinary. Then criticizing it becomes the real offense. People adapt because adaptation is easier than resistance. They tell themselves they are being practical, flexible, mature. They make small compromises to survive inside a system that rewards compromise. And after enough time passes, they may not even remember that there was another way to live. The Damascus Document seems deeply concerned with exactly that process. Not just individual wrongdoing, but collective forgetting, the loss of moral memory, the moment when a community can still possess its scriptures, rituals, and leaders, yet no longer recognize the purpose behind any of them. For its authors, the final generation may have been the generation that inherited all the outward forms of faith while standing dangerously close to losing its inner substance. And there is another possibility scholars raise. The phrase may reflect the community's conviction that they themselves were living near the end of a predetermined period of history. The document includes complex chronological ideas, including references to long spans of time between Israel's past unfaithfulness and the emergence of the group's own movement. These calculations are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. The manuscripts are fragmented, the language is compressed, and scholars do not all agree on how the numbers should be read. But the basic pattern is clear enough. They believed history had a schedule. Not a schedule humans could fully control, not necessarily one they could calculate down to the day, but a pattern set by God, moving through periods of rebellion, punishment, restoration, and final testing. In that framework, calling themselves the final generation was a way of locating their own lives inside a much larger timeline. They were not merely a small sect arguing over religious rules in the desert. They believed they had arrived at the most dangerous point in the story. And once you believe that ordinary life changes completely, every decision becomes heavier, every compromise looks more dangerous. Every teacher, ruler, and religious leader has to be evaluated, not by reputation, not by status, not by how confidently they speak, but by whether their actions lead people toward faithfulness or away from it. And that is one reason modern audiences recognize the urgency of this ancient warning so quickly. We may not live in first-century Judea. We do not share the Damascus Document's exact rules, its calendar, its political world, or its expectations about how history would unfold. It would be a mistake to pretend that an ancient sect was directly predicting our headlines. The scroll does not name our nations, our technology, or our future. It was written for a real community, facing real crises in its own time. But the emotional force of its message still lands because the underlying experience is familiar. We know what it feels like to live through rapid change, to wake up each morning to another crisis, another scandal, another warning that the institutions meant to hold society together are under strain. We know what it feels like when information is everywhere, but certainty is nowhere. When competing voices all claim to possess the truth. When people stop trusting leaders, media, experts, churches, governments, even neighbours, when the sheer volume of noise makes moral clarity feel almost impossible. Picture this. You are living in a world where every group tells you that the other group is lying. Every day brings new evidence that somebody powerful has failed, cheated, covered something up, or put private interests ahead of the public good. Your attention is pulled in 10 directions at once. Your anger is always available. Your fear is constantly being fed. And slowly, almost without noticing, you begin to accept things that would have shocked you a few years earlier. That is the kind of momentum the Damascus Document feared. Not necessarily one single catastrophe falling from the sky. Something slower. A culture becoming unable to distinguish truth from manipulation. A people becoming so accustomed to compromise that compromise stops feeling like compromise. A society where the problem is not that nobody talks about morality, but that everyone talks about morality while using it as a weapon against everyone else. The people behind the scrolls would have recognized that danger immediately. They believed deception was most powerful when it did not look like deception. It could appear respectable, traditional, official. It could be supported by institutions. It could be repeated so often that people stopped asking whether it was true. And that is why their warning feels less like an ancient curiosity and more like a message sent across time. Modern life gives us more connection than any previous generation could have imagined. A person can hear from thousands of voices before breakfast. We can watch events unfold on the other side of the planet in real time. We have access to libraries of knowledge in a device small enough to fit in a pocket. But access to information is not the same thing as wisdom. In some ways it may make wisdom harder, because wisdom requires attention, patience, humility, and the willingness to admit when we have been misled. The Damascus community had a brutal answer to that problem. Slow down. Remember the covenant. Examine your life. Do not let the crowd decide what is right. Do not assume that power is proof of truth. Do not mistake religious language for religious integrity. Now their solution was shaped by their own world. They created strict boundaries and demanded intense discipline from members. Modern people will disagree about whether that model is healthy, practical, or even possible. And historians should be careful not to turn the Dead Sea Scrolls into a simple blueprint for our age. But the question beneath their discipline remains difficult to escape. What happens when a society loses its ability to examine itself? What happens when people become so busy defending their side that they no longer care whether their side is right? What happens when the desire to win replaces the desire to be honest? Those are not just religious questions, they are human questions. And they are exactly the kind of questions that make a text like the Damascus Document feel unsettlingly current. If you want to go deeper into mysteries that still resist easy answers, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. It explores the kinds of historical puzzles where the evidence is real, the questions are massive, and certainty remains just out of reach. But back to this warning, because its urgency is not really about predicting a date. That may be the most important point of all. People have been announcing the end of the world for thousands of years. They have pointed to wars, plagues, eclipses, earthquakes, political collapses, and strange signs in the sky. They have set dates, they have drawn charts, they have watched predictions fail and then moved the deadline again. History gives us every reason to be cautious when someone claims absolute certainty that the final moment has arrived. The Damascus Document itself comes from people who believe they were living in a decisive age. Yet the world did not end in their lifetime. Rome continued. Empires rose and fell. Their community disappeared. Their manuscripts were hidden in caves, and nearly 2,000 years passed before many of those texts were found again. That does not make their warning meaningless. It changes how we should hear it. Maybe the deepest power of the final generation is not that it allows us to identify the last people on earth. Maybe it forces every generation to ask whether it is becoming the kind of generation that cannot recognize danger until danger is already inside the house. The document calls its readers to live as though choices matter now, not later. To refuse the comforting fantasy that someone else will fix what is broken. To understand that corruption is not only something done by villains far away. It grows through ordinary consent, through silence. Through habits, through the little excuses people make when truth becomes inconvenient. That is urgent in any century, and perhaps that is why these desert manuscripts still speak with such force. They do not let us stand at a safe distance and judge ancient people for being afraid of the end. They turn the question back toward us. What are we tolerating because resistance is costly? What have we normalized because everyone else has? What voices are we trusting simply because they tell us what we already want to hear? For the community behind the Damascus Document, judgment began long before any final day. It began when people chose a path, then kept walking it. And the first warning was simple. Before darkness becomes obvious, it learns how to hide in plain sight. Number 2. Belial's hidden influence. The first warning asked a terrifying question. What if darkness does not arrive wearing the face of darkness? What if it enters through familiar habits, respectable voices and small decisions that barely seem dangerous at the time? For the people behind the Dead Sea Scrolls there was a name for the power behind that kind of corruption. Belial, now. That name can sound simple to modern ears. A demon, the devil, the ancient equivalent of a movie villain standing in the shadows and pulling strings. But the Qumran worldview was more complex than that. Belial was not just one bad character in a cosmic story. He was the leader of the forces, opposed to God, the ruler of a domain defined by falsehood, rebellion, impurity, and destruction. In some scrolls, he is called the Angel of Darkness. In others, Belial appears as the force who leads people into the paths of wickedness. The community rule describes humanity in stark terms. People are divided between two spirits, the spirit of truth and the spirit of perversity. One belongs to the Prince of Lights. The other belongs to the Angel of Darkness. That sounds like an absolute split. Light on one side, darkness on the other, God's people on one side, Belial's people on the other. And for the Qumran community, it was not merely poetic language. They believed the visible world was caught inside an invisible conflict. The arguments, betrayals, failures, rival teachings, and political violence around them were not random events. They were signs of a deeper war already underway. Behind the chaos of history stood rival powers. And every human being, whether they understood it or not, was being pulled toward one side or the other. Picture the world as they saw it. Judea was a small land trapped between enormous empires. Foreign armies had marched through it. Kings had risen and fallen. Priests controlled the temple in Jerusalem, but the Qumran sect believed many of those leaders had become corrupt. Different Jewish groups disagreed over law, ritual, calendar, authority, and the meaning of Scripture. Every claim to truth came with a competing claim. Every sacred tradition seemed to have an argument attached to it. For a community seeking certainty, this was not just confusing. It was dangerous. They did not think the central problem was a lack of religion. Their world was full of religion. The temple stood in Jerusalem. Sacred texts were copied and debated. Teachers claimed to explain God's will. People offered sacrifices, observed festivals, and argued passionately over holiness. The danger, as Qumran saw it, was that people could speak the language of God while serving a completely different power. That is where Belial enters the story. The Hebrew term behind the name has a long and complicated history. In parts of the Hebrew Bible, Belial can function more like a description than a personal name. It can refer to worthlessness, wickedness, or people considered lawless. But by the time many of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, Belial had become a far more defined figure. Not simply wickedness in general, but the supernatural leader of wickedness. This matters because it shows us something happening in ancient Jewish thought. Evil was no longer understood only as an individual failure, a person making a bad choice on a bad day. Evil could also be organized. It could have direction. It could work through systems, loyalties, teachings, and communities. The Qumran group believed history itself had been arranged into appointed periods. God remained completely sovereign. That part was crucial. Belial was powerful, but he was not equal to God. He was not an independent god of darkness battling a god of light in some endless stalemate. The scrolls do not teach that the universe is a 50-50 contest. Belial operates within limits. Even the age of darkness has an endpoint. The community rule says that God created the spirits of light and darkness and established their courses. That idea can feel unsettling. If God governs all history, why permit Belial any influence at all? The scrolls do not give a philosophical answer that satisfies every modern reader. But they insist that the conflict has a schedule. Darkness may be active now. It may look overwhelming. It may appear to control the public world. But its time is measured, and that belief gave the community a strange kind of confidence. They were not hiding in the desert because they thought darkness had won forever. They were preparing because they believed darkness was living on borrowed time. The War Scroll makes this even more dramatic. It imagines a final conflict between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Belial stands with the forces of darkness, alongside foreign nations and those portrayed as faithless within Israel itself. The language is military, intense, and apocalyptic. Trumpets, formations, priestly speeches, battles planned in stages. It reads less like a private meditation and more like a blueprint for the last war in history. But again, the outcome is never in doubt. Belial can attack. He can deceive. He can gather forces. He can make the darkness seem immense. But he cannot overturn the divine plan. The community's texts repeatedly return to the same conviction. The dominion of Belial will eventually be broken. That certainty helps explain why these writings can sound so severe. If you believe the world is divided between two opposing dominions, then neutrality becomes almost impossible. A ritual is not just a ritual. A calendar is not just a calendar. A teacher is not just a teacher. A compromise is not just a compromise. Everything becomes evidence of allegiance. And that is the part modern readers often miss. Belial was not important to the Qumran community because they were fascinated by demons. He was important because he gave them a way to explain why a world filled with sacred language could still feel spiritually upside down. But once you believe darkness has a leader, the next question becomes unavoidable. How exactly does that leader gain influence over ordinary people, according to the scrolls, not mainly through spectacular evil? Not through a stranger announcing that he has come to destroy the community. Not through an obvious enemy carrying a banner of darkness. That would be too easy to recognize, too easy to resist. Belial's influence works through disorder, through the slow breakdown of the habits that allow a people to tell truth from falsehood, justice from self-interest, faithfulness from performance. The community rule describes the spirit associated with darkness through a long list of qualities: greed, lying, pride, hypocrisy, cruelty, impurity, anger, and wandering from the right path. It is a disturbing list because almost none of these begin as public catastrophes. They begin inside ordinary human lives. A person bends the truth to avoid embarrassment. Another person takes more than they need because nobody is watching. A leader accepts praise they have not earned. Someone claims moral authority while quietly violating the standards they demand from everyone else. One compromise becomes a habit. The habit becomes normal. And eventually, the people who still object begin to look unreasonable. That the scrolls suggest is how darkness spreads. Not always by making people love evil, sometimes by making them tired of resisting it. Picture a community under pressure. Resources are limited. Outside enemies are powerful. Religious leaders disagree. People are suspicious of one another. Every rumour feels dangerous. Every disagreement feels like betrayal. Under those conditions, trust becomes fragile. And when trust breaks down, fear rushes in to fill the empty space. The Qumran writers saw this as more than a social problem. They saw it as spiritual disorder. A person under Belial's influence was not necessarily someone who had abandoned religion. In fact, they might be deeply religious. They might know scripture, observe rituals, make public displays of devotion, and speak confidently about holiness. But if their actions produced deceit, exploitation, division, or contempt for others, then something had gone wrong at a deeper level. This is one of the sharpest warnings in the scrolls. Religious activity by itself is not proof of spiritual health. The Qumran community was obsessed with purity, but purity did not mean merely washing the body or avoiding certain foods. Their texts repeatedly connect outward behaviour to inward truth. You could enter water, you could follow rules, you could say the correct words, but if your heart remained committed to deception, the ritual changed nothing. The community rule puts the idea bluntly. No one is purified by water while refusing to turn away from wickedness. The body may be washed, but the person remains unclean. That is a radical claim in any age. It means corruption cannot be solved through appearances. You cannot cover a dishonest life with sacred language. You cannot fix injustice by performing the right ceremony. You cannot restore a broken community if the people inside it are still feeding the same rivalries, resentments, and lies that broke it in the first place. For the Qumran sect, Belial thrived wherever people separated public holiness from private conduct. And the results were not only personal, they were social. The scrolls describe a world where the wrong people could gain influence, where false speech could confuse the faithful, where anger could fracture communities, and where people could be led away from what the group believed was God's covenant. In their view, the Age of Darkness did not just produce individual sinners. It produced instability, confusion, competing loyalties, a society in which the moral compass had started spinning. Think about what that does to a community over time. When truth is treated as flexible, people stop trusting testimony. When leaders are hypocritical, people stop respecting authority. When greed becomes normal, the vulnerable are treated as burdens. When anger becomes a source of identity, every disagreement hardens into a conflict. And when conflict becomes permanent, unity begins to feel impossible. The people at Qumran believed this fragmentation was exactly what the forces of darkness wanted. A divided people are easier to mislead. That does not mean every disagreement is demonic, or that every outsider is an enemy. The scrolls are sectarian writings shaped by a community that often drew boundaries far more sharply than many people today would find comfortable. We should be careful not to turn their worldview into a simple historical report. These are religious interpretations of crisis, not neutral descriptions of every group they opposed. But their underlying concern is still clear. A society can become spiritually disordered long before it recognizes the damage. It can keep functioning. Markets open, authorities speak. Religious institutions continue. Families gather, yet beneath the surface, honesty erodes, resentment accumulates, and people begin rewarding the very traits they once condemned. That is why the language of Belial is so powerful. It gives a name to corruption that feels larger than one person's failure. The problem is not only that individuals do wrong things. The problem is that wrongdoing can become contagious. It can move through relationships, institutions, stories, and expectations until it begins to feel like the natural order of the world. And if you want to go deeper into the strange questions ancient texts and history still leave behind, there's a book on our website about 12 unexplained mysteries. The link is in the description. For the Qumran community, the answer to disorder was not passive concern. It was discipline, watchfulness, a deliberate refusal to let falsehood become familiar. They believed every person had to examine their path, because the battle between truth and perversity was not happening only in distant places or at the end of history. It was happening in speech, in loyalty, in the treatment of other people, in the quiet choices no one else could see. But that raises an even more unsettling question. What happens when people do not realize they are being led astray at all? That is the fear behind manipulation in every age. Not simply that someone might lie to you. People have always lied. The deeper fear is that you might be surrounded by lies so often, in so many forms, that eventually you lose the ability to recognize them as lies. You start calling them realism, common sense, just the way the world works. The Qumran writers did not have social media, 24-hour news cycles, targeted advertising, political consulting firms, algorithmic feeds, or artificial intelligence. They lived under Roman power, in a world of priests, kings, soldiers, tax collectors, rival religious movements, and rumours carried from village to village. But they understood something that still feels painfully familiar. Human beings are vulnerable when they are confused, frightened, isolated, and angry. Under those conditions, people do not always choose what is true. They choose what gives them certainty. They choose the voice that sounds confident. They choose the group that offers belonging. They choose the explanation that turns a complicated world into a simple story with obvious villains. And that is where the ancient warning becomes uncomfortably current. Today, many people worry that they are being manipulated by governments, by corporations, by media organizations, by online influencers, by religious figures, by political movements, by systems designed to capture attention, provoke outrage, and keep people scrolling long after they have stopped learning anything useful. Some of those fears are grounded in real practices. Advertising really is designed to shape desire. Political messaging really can exploit emotion. Social platforms really do reward content that produces strong reactions. Powerful institutions can conceal information, protect themselves, and influence public opinion. But there is another danger too. The fear of manipulation can itself become a tool of manipulation. Once a person becomes convinced that everything is controlled, every disagreement becomes proof of a hidden plot. Every mistake becomes intentional. Every source of information becomes suspect, except the one voice that claims to reveal the secret truth. That is not freedom from deception. It may be another form of captivity. The Qumran community would probably have described that as a world where darkness wins by making trust impossible. Think about it. If nobody can be believed, then evidence no longer matters. If every institution is corrupt beyond repair, then accountability becomes pointless. If every person who disagrees with you is evil, stupid, or secretly controlled, then conversation ends before it begins. And once conversation ends, the loudest voices take over. This is why Belial is such a useful symbol, even for people who do not share the Qumran community's theology. Belial represents the force that pulls human beings away from clarity and toward confusion, away from self-examination and toward blame, away from responsibility and toward the comforting belief that corruption belongs only to somebody else. Because manipulation rarely begins with a command. It begins with a nudge, a headline that makes you angry before you know the facts. A rumour repeated often enough that it starts to feel established. A video clipped just carefully enough to remove the context. A public figure who tells you exactly what you want to hear. A community that rewards outrage more than wisdom. A stream of content that gradually teaches you to distrust everyone outside your own circle. None of these things require a supernatural explanation. They are ordinary human mechanisms. They involve money, status, fear, technology, and the oldest weakness of all, the desire to feel certain in an uncertain world. But the scrolls would insist that ordinary does not mean harmless. Picture someone checking their phone first thing in the morning, before speaking to family, before stepping outside, before thinking clearly. Within minutes they have absorbed arguments, accusations, disasters, insults, predictions, and competing claims about what is happening to the world. One source says the country is collapsing. Another says civilization is under attack. Another says a hidden enemy is controlling everything. Another says anybody who asks questions is dangerous. By the time that person puts the phone down, they may feel informed. But are they wiser? That is the question. The people at Qumran believed moral clarity required discipline because the human mind does not naturally drift toward truth. It drifts toward comfort, pride, fear, and self-justification. Their answer was strict, and in some ways extreme. Separate from corrupt influences, submit to communal rules, confess wrongdoing, study sacred teaching, and remain alert for deception. We do not have to copy their isolated way of life to recognize the challenge they identified. How do you remain honest when dishonesty is profitable? How do you stay calm when outrage is rewarded? How do you admit uncertainty when everyone around you is performing absolute certainty? How do you resist being shaped by forces you can barely see? There is no simple answer, and historically we should not pretend the Dead Sea Scrolls give us a modern political program or a secret map of current events. They do not. Their language emerged from a specific Jewish community living through the tensions of the late Second Temple period. Their beliefs about Belial were religious convictions, not evidence that every conflict has an invisible mastermind behind it. But their warning about the human side of deception remains difficult to dismiss. The most dangerous influence may be the one that teaches us we do not need to examine ourselves. Belial, in this sense, is not just the enemy out there. It is the voice that tells you your side never lies. Your anger is always righteous. Your opponents are beyond redemption. Your own compromises do not count. You do not need facts. You do not need patience. You do not need humility. Just choose a side, hate the other side, and never look back. The Qumran writers believed that path led to ruin. Not because conflict itself was always wrong, not because every difference should be erased, but because a people who cannot distinguish truth from propaganda, conviction from cruelty, or vigilance from paranoia will eventually become easy to lead, and they may not even notice who is leading them. That is the final warning hidden inside Belial's influence. Darkness does not always arrive by destroying the truth outright. Sometimes it surrounds the truth with so much noise that nobody can hear it anymore. And in the scrolls, that confusion was never the end of the story. Because if darkness could spread through a community, then light had to be something more than a private belief. It had to become a battle. Number 3. The war of light against darkness. And this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls become almost cinematic. Among the manuscripts found near Qumran is a text commonly called the War Scroll. Its ancient title is longer, and its contents are stranger, a detailed vision of a final conflict, written with the precision of a military manual and the intensity of an apocalypse. This is not a vague prediction that good will somehow defeat evil in the end. The War Scroll imagines banners, trumpets, priests, infantry formations, sacred speeches before battle, specific divisions of troops, rules for armour, signals for advancing, retreating, and regrouping. It describes a war that unfolds in stages with victories and reversals, moments where the outcome appears uncertain, and a final intervention by God. Picture the scene: a community living on the edge of the Judean desert, surrounded by powers it could not control. Jerusalem was dominated by rival priestly groups. The land was under Roman rule. Armies marched along its roads, taxes flowed out, local rulers changed. Rebellions were crushed. People disappeared into prisons, into slavery, into graves. And somewhere near the Dead Sea, a small religious movement copied a document imagining the ultimate battlefield. Not a battlefield like the ones we see in modern war films with drones, satellite images, missiles and command centres glowing with screens. Their battlefield was physical, close, terrifyingly close. Lines of armed men facing one another across open ground. Metal striking metal, dust rising beneath sandals. Horns sounding orders over the shouting. Priests standing near the fighters, declaring that the battle was not merely about land or power. It was about the structure of reality itself. The War Scroll lays out its conflict with an almost unsettling level of organisation. There are units arranged by thousands, hundreds, fifties and tens. There are ceremonial shields and weapons bearing inscriptions. There are trumpets assigned to different moments in the battle. Trumpets for assembly, trumpets for attack, trumpets for pursuit, trumpets for the return of the slain. That last detail tells you something important. The writers were not imagining a clean, painless victory. They knew war meant bodies. It meant casualties. It meant fighters carried away from the field. The document does not hide the cost behind elegant religious language. It imagines a sacred conflict, yes, but still a conflict soaked in human danger. And that makes the scroll more disturbing than a simple story where heroes win easily. The battle is organised down to the smallest details, because chaos is the enemy. In their vision, the forces aligned with God do not rush forward in blind fury. They are ordered, prepared, disciplined, Their weapons, ranks, prayers and movements are coordinated. Even their language is controlled. It is as if the writers believed darkness thrives when a people are scattered, panicked and divided, while light requires people to become steady enough to stand together under pressure. That idea still lands, because whenever a society feels like it is entering a period of crisis, people begin reaching for battle language. They say the country is at war, truth is under attack. Families are under attack. Faith is under attack. Democracy is under attack. The future is under attack. Sometimes those words point to real threats. Sometimes they are used to manufacture fear, and sometimes they turn every disagreement into an emergency, every opponent into an enemy, every compromise into betrayal. The war scroll comes from a world where that language was not metaphorical. Rome really did have soldiers. Cities really could be destroyed. Religious disputes could lead to exile, violence, and execution. The Qumran writers did not invent their fear out of nowhere, but they transformed that fear into a cosmic map. Their enemies were not simply political rivals with competing interests. The battlefield became the place where heaven and earth met. Every formation had meaning. Every trumpet blast carried spiritual weight. Every moment of apparent defeat could be understood as part of a larger plan. That is one reason the War Scroll has fascinated readers for so long. It gives order to the unbearable idea that history might be spinning out of control. If you enjoy these kinds of ancient puzzles, the book about 12 Unexplained Mysteries is available on the website, with the link in the description. Because the War Scroll is exactly that kind of mystery, a document that sounds at moments less like ordinary religious writing and more like someone trying to record the battle plan for the end of the world. But we need to be careful here. We do not know whether every detail in the manuscript was meant as a literal future military strategy. The surviving text is damaged in places. Scholars debate how it was composed, whether it was used in ritual settings, and how closely it reflected the expectations of the people who preserved it. It may have drawn on biblical language, older traditions of holy war, and the political anxieties of its own time. Still, the battlefield vision is unmistakable. The final struggle would not be quick. The War Scroll describes a conflict extending through multiple phases, traditionally understood as lasting 40 years. That number matters. In biblical tradition, 40 often signals testing, wandering, preparation, and transformation. Israel wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. Moses spent 40 days on the mountain. 40 was never just a number on a calendar. It meant a long period where a people were being revealed for what they truly were. So this war was not imagined as one dramatic afternoon, where evil collapsed and everyone went home. It was a prolonged ordeal. There would be advances. There would be setbacks. At points, the enemy would seem to gain ground. The faithful would not simply watch from a safe distance, while God solved everything for them. They would be drawn into the crisis. They would have to endure it. And that is where the War Scroll becomes more than an ancient fantasy of victory. Because its battlefield is not built around comfort. It is built around the question of what happens when people believe they have reached the decisive moment, when neutrality feels impossible, when the world seems divided between forces that cannot be reconciled. Who exactly did the writers believe would stand on each side of that field? The answer begins with two names that sound simple, almost too simple: the sons of light and the sons of darkness. But in the world of the War Scroll, these were not casual labels. They were identities. They told you where a person stood in the universe, who they belonged to, what kind of future they were moving toward, and whether they would survive the final reckoning. The Sons of Light were the people the community believed had remained faithful to God's covenant. In the language of the scrolls, they are often connected with Israel, with the community's own members, and with groups the writers considered true inheritors of the sacred promises. But there is an important complication. The people at Qumran did not seem to believe that every Israelite automatically belonged among the sons of light. That would have been far too easy. They believed much of the wider religious world had become compromised. The wrong priests controlled the temple. Sacred laws were being interpreted incorrectly. Leaders made agreements with foreign powers. Ordinary people followed teachers the community considered blind, corrupt, or spiritually deceived. So being born into the right nation was not enough. You had to choose the right path. You had to live by the community's interpretation of the law. You had to accept its authority. You had to separate yourself from practices it regarded as impure. You had to submit to discipline, confession, ritual washing, shared rules, and a demanding vision of obedience. In other words, the sons of light were not simply the good guys in a story. They were the faithful remnant, a small group within a much larger world convinced that most people had missed the point. And you can see why that belief was powerful. Imagine living under Roman occupation, watching elite families hold power, seeing religious arguments tear communities apart, and feeling that the institutions meant to protect truth had become part of the problem. It would be tempting to look around and think, everyone has compromised. Everyone has drifted. Everyone has made peace with darkness. Except us. That is the emotional force behind the phrase, sons of light. It gave the community a way to understand its isolation. They were not abandoned in the wilderness because they were irrelevant. They were in the wilderness because they had been separated out. They were not a forgotten minority. They were the people being prepared. And then there were the sons of darkness. This category was much broader and much more alarming. The War Scroll associates them with Belial, the dark spiritual figure already mentioned in the scrolls, and with nations portrayed as enemies of God's people. The text names groups familiar from biblical and ancient Near Eastern traditions: Edom, Moab, Ammon, Philistia, and the Kittim. That last name matters. Kittim originally referred to people connected with Cyprus or the Western Mediterranean. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls it is often understood as a coded or expanded reference to the great imperial power looming over Judea, Rome. So the sons of darkness could include foreign oppressors, armies, pagan nations, the machinery of empire. But they were not limited to outsiders. That is what makes the War Scrolls division so unsettling. Darkness could also include Israelites who were seen as unfaithful, fellow Jews, priests, political leaders, rival religious groups, people who prayed to the same God, read the same scriptures, and lived in the same land, but whom the Qumran community believed had chosen the wrong allegiance. The dividing line was not ethnicity alone, it was loyalty. And once a community begins seeing loyalty in cosmic terms, every disagreement can become terrifyingly absolute. You are no longer arguing over policy, custom, leadership, or interpretation. You are deciding who belongs to light and who has been claimed by darkness. That mindset did not begin at Qumran, and it did not end there. Human beings have always been drawn to sharp moral categories, especially during periods of fear. When life feels unstable, ambiguity can feel unbearable. It is easier to believe there are only two sides, the pure and the corrupt, the awake and the deceived, the loyal and the traitorous, the people trying to save the world and the people trying to destroy it. And sometimes, of course, moral clarity is necessary. Not every conflict is imaginary. Real cruelty exists. Real oppression exists. Real lies can damage lives and nations. But the Dead Sea Scrolls show how quickly the search for clarity can become totalizing. Because if your opponents are not merely mistaken, but children of darkness, then listening to them can feel like betrayal. Compassion can look like weakness. Doubt can look like disloyalty. And the possibility that you might be wrong becomes almost impossible to consider. The Qumran community did not invent this danger. They lived in a harsh world, and their writings reflect genuine pressure, disappointment, and fear. We should not flatten them into caricatures or pretend we can fully reconstruct what every member believed. But their language remains startling. They saw history as divided between two spirits, two paths, two destinies. Light and darkness were not just poetic images. They were competing powers shaping human choices from within. And that raises an even deeper question. If the sons of light were expected to recognize darkness in the world around them, how were they supposed to keep that darkness from taking root inside themselves? That question sits at the center of the War Scroll, because was this war meant to happen on an actual battlefield, with actual armies, banners, weapons, and casualties? Or was it something else? A symbolic map of the human soul? A warning about moral compromise? A way of saying that every person is pulled between truth and deception, discipline and desire, faithfulness and betrayal? The honest answer is probably both. The War Scroll is not written like a vague spiritual poem. It is remarkably concrete. It lays out formations, periods of conflict, priestly roles, sacred language, and a sequence of events that sounds like a real campaign. The writers appear to have imagined history moving toward a decisive confrontation in the real world. They expected God to act. They expected evil powers to be defeated. And they believed their own community had a role to play in that coming moment. For them, this was not just an inner feeling. It was history heading somewhere. But the scrolls also make clear that the visible conflict was only part of the story. Behind human rulers, armies, and political disasters, they saw invisible forces. The struggle was spiritual before it was military. A person could be physically safe, living an ordinary life, following religious customs, and still be losing the war inside. That is why their rules were so strict. The community cared about what people ate, how they purified themselves, how they spoke, how they handled money, how they treated one another, how they interpreted scripture, and whether they obeyed communal authority. To a modern reader, some of this can seem intensely controlling. And it probably was, but from their perspective, these details were preparation. You do not wait until the final battle to decide who you are. You decide in private. You decide when no army is marching, when no enemy is at the gate, when nobody is applauding your courage or condemning your fear. You decide through habits, loyalties, small compromises, and the stories you allow yourself to believe. That is where the symbolic power of the War Scroll becomes impossible to ignore. The darkness is not only out there, attached to some enemy nation or corrupt institution. It can appear as greed that feels reasonable, anger that feels righteous, a lie told for a good cause, a leader who promises security by making everyone else the enemy, a crowd that demands purity from others while excusing cruelty in itself. And that is exactly why these ancient texts still feel current. We live in an age that constantly tells us we are in a final battle. Every political argument becomes an existential emergency. Every disagreement is framed as proof that the other side is evil, insane, dangerous, or beyond redemption. People are sorted into categories at incredible speed. Friend or enemy, awake or brainwashed, patriot or traitor, victim or oppressor. The language has changed, the emotional pattern has not. The War Scroll reminds us that apocalyptic thinking can do two very different things. It can give suffering people hope that injustice will not last forever, that powerful systems are not permanent, that evil does not get the final word. But it can also make people dangerous, because once you become certain that you are fighting absolute darkness, almost anything can start to look justified. humiliation, exclusion, dehumanization, violence. The moral limits that should restrain us begin to feel like obstacles placed there by the enemy. That is not an accusation against the people who copied and preserved these scrolls. They were living through occupation, instability, religious conflict, and the enormous pressure of a world they believed was coming apart. Their expectation of divine justice came from real wounds. But their writings force us to confront a question that is just as urgent now as it was then. What happens when a community becomes so focused on defeating darkness that it stops examining itself? The Dead Sea Scrolls do not give us one simple answer. Scholars still debate how literally the Qumran community expected these prophecies to unfold. Some believe the war scroll reflects a detailed expectation of an end-time military conflict. Others see it as liturgical, ideological, or symbolic, perhaps used to shape the community's identity more than to plan an actual uprising. It may have been copied, edited, and reimagined over time by people facing different crises. We cannot know with certainty exactly how every reader understood it. But we can know this: the text was designed to make its audience feel that history had moral stakes. Their choices mattered, their loyalties mattered, their private conduct mattered. The war was coming in one form or another, and nobody could remain neutral forever. That idea is powerful because it contains a truth. Our choices do matter. Corruption does not become harmless because it is common. Lies do not become true because they are repeated by powerful people. A society can drift toward cruelty, one compromise at a time. But there is another truth. The war scroll makes us see almost by accident. The people most certain they stand with light may be the people most in need of humility. If you want to go deeper into mysteries that still resist easy answers, including 12 cases that continue to puzzle historians and researchers, there's a book available on the website. The link is in the description. The final conflict imagined in the war scroll may never have unfolded exactly as its writers expected. Rome did not vanish in the way the text envisioned. History did not resolve itself into one clean final victory where every question was settled forever. Instead, the world remained complicated. Empires fell and new empires rose. Religious movements divided. Communities that believed they were pure discovered corruption in their own ranks. And generation after generation faced the same temptation to identify evil only in someone else. Maybe that is the deepest warning here. The war of light against darkness is not only about what threatens us from outside, it is also about what happens when fear, power, and certainty take control of those who claim to be defending what is good. And nowhere does that danger become more visible than in the people entrusted to lead. Number 4, corrupt leaders who mislead the people. And this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls become intensely personal. The writers were not only worried about foreign armies, cosmic evil, or some final war at the end of history. They were furious at the people who claimed to speak for God right now: priests, teachers, interpreters of Scripture, men with religious authority, public influence, and the power to tell ordinary people what faithfulness was supposed to look like. According to the sectarian scrolls, those leaders had failed. Not by making one innocent mistake, not by disagreeing over some minor ritual detail. The community believed rival leaders were leading the entire nation away from the truth. They had polluted worship. They had compromised with power. They had made sacred authority serve political ambition, wealth, status, and control. That was the accusation, and it is important to be careful here. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not neutral reports from outside the conflict. They are the writings of a community deeply convinced that it possessed the correct interpretation of God's covenant. Their opponents do not get to answer back on the page. We are hearing one side of an ancient religious argument, often written in language meant to condemn, expose and warn. But that language tells us something. These people believed the greatest danger was not always an enemy wearing a foreign uniform. Sometimes the danger stood at the altar. Picture the world they inhabited. Judea was small, pressured, and politically unstable. Great empires had passed through it for centuries. Persian rulers, Greek kings, then the Hasmonean dynasty, a Jewish ruling family that had begun in rebellion against foreign oppression, but eventually became a powerful priestly monarchy itself. Later, Rome would move in and make everything more volatile. In a world like that, religious leadership was never just religious. The temple in Jerusalem was not merely a building where people prayed. It was the centre of national life. It involved sacrifice, pilgrimage, money, purity, law, land, and political legitimacy. Whoever controlled the temple could shape the moral imagination of the people. They could define what was clean and unclean, faithful and rebellious, holy and dangerous. That is why the conflict in the scrolls burns with such intensity. The Qumran community seems to have looked at the religious establishment in Jerusalem and seen betrayal. They believed the system had become corrupted from the top down. Priests who should have guarded holiness were, in their view, serving themselves. Teachers who should have guided the people were smoothing over hard truths. Leaders who should have separated themselves from injustice had learned to live comfortably beside it. The scrolls sometimes speak of opponents with names that sound more like accusations than ordinary titles. Seekers of smooth things, the man of lies, the spouter of lies. These labels are difficult to identify with certainty. Scholars have proposed Pharisees, Sadducees, Jerusalem priests, Hasmonean rulers, or other rival Jewish groups. The problem is that the texts are coded, polemical, and written within disputes we can only partly reconstruct. We do not know exactly who every enemy was, but we know what the community thought those enemies were doing. They were making faith easier when it was supposed to be demanding. They were telling people what they wanted to hear. They were turning obedience into something flexible enough to fit the needs of the powerful. And maybe that is why the phrase smooth things has such force. It suggests teaching that slides easily into the mind because it does not challenge anything. No sharp edge, no cost, no uncomfortable demand to change. Just a message designed to reassure the listener that everything is fine, especially if that listener already has influence, money, or social standing. The people at Qumran wanted the opposite. They wanted strictness, separation, discipline, a community that would rather be small and rejected than popular and compromised. To them, the majority could not be trusted simply because it was the majority. A crowded temple, a respected priesthood, and centuries of tradition meant nothing if the leaders had departed from the covenant. That is a radical claim. It means the people preserving these scrolls saw themselves not as rebels against God's order, but as the last faithful remnant protecting it from those who had hijacked it. If you want to explore more mysteries where the official story is still incomplete, there is a book on the website about 12 unexplained mysteries that continue to puzzle historians and researchers. The link is in the description, but before we admire the Qumran community too quickly, there is a difficult tension here. Every movement that condemns corrupt leadership faces the same risk. It may be right about the corruption. It may see hypocrisy that others refuse to acknowledge. It may recognize that institutions can protect themselves long after they stop serving the truth. But it can also become convinced that only its own members are pure. The scrolls are filled with this tension. Their anger at rival leaders came from a serious moral vision. They believed holiness mattered. They believed public teachers carried enormous responsibility. And they believed a leader who misused sacred authority could damage not just individual lives, but an entire people. Yet their certainty also sharpened the boundaries between us and them, And among all the hostile figures who appear in these writings, one stands above the rest, a leader remembered not by a clear name, but by a chilling title, the wicked priest. The wicked priest appears most clearly in a text called the Habakkuk Pesher. A Pesher is not just a commentary in the modern sense. It takes words from an ancient prophet and declares that their hidden meaning has been revealed in the present. Habakkuk had spoken centuries earlier about violence, injustice, arrogant rulers, and the coming judgment of God. The Qumran writers believed those old words were not finished. They had been waiting for their real fulfillment in the conflicts of their own time. And in that interpretation, the wicked priest becomes a central villain. The text says that this priest was once called by a more honourable name. He had risen to power, perhaps even beginning as someone respected by his people. But then, according to the community, something changed. Wealth corrupted him, power intoxicated him. He abandoned the law he was supposed to protect and turned against the righteous people who had once trusted him. The exact wording is brutal. The wicked priest is accused of pursuing the teacher of righteousness, the founding figure or spiritual leader of the Qumran movement. He is said to have hunted him down in the heat of his anger, even appearing at the place where the teacher and his followers were observing a sacred day. That detail matters. For this community, holy time was not negotiable. Their calendar, their festivals, their interpretation of the Sabbath, all of it separated them from the religious establishment in Jerusalem. So the image of the wicked priest arriving on a holy day is more than a report of harassment. It is a symbol of violation. The man responsible for guarding sacred order had become the one who shattered it. But who was he? That is the mystery. The scrolls never give us a simple name. No line says, the wicked priest was this ruler, born here, who reigned from this year to that year. Instead, we get fragments, accusations, allusions, a portrait assembled from hostile clues. Many scholars think the title refers to a Hasmonean high priest, one of the rulers who combined religious and political authority in Judea during the 2nd and 1st centuries before Christ, that would fit the world behind the scrolls. The Hasmoneans had begun as heroes to many Jews. Their family, the Maccabees, had led a revolt against the Seleucid Empire and defended Jewish worship against forced Hellenization. But later Hasmonean rulers took the title of high priest while also ruling as kings. To the Qumran community, that may have looked like the original betrayal. The priesthood was supposed to descend through a specific sacred line, the line of Zadok. At least that is what this group believed. A ruler who seized priestly authority without the right ancestry, or who used the temple office to strengthen his political position, would not merely be an imperfect leader. He would be an illegitimate one, a counterfeit guardian of holiness, standing at the centre of the nation. Several names have been proposed. Jonathan Aphus is one possibility. He was a Hasmonean leader who became high priest around 152 BC, after political negotiations with a foreign king. For some scholars, that is exactly the kind of event the Qumran writers could have viewed as a corruption of sacred office. Others point to Simon, Jonathan's brother, or to later rulers such as John Hyrcanus, Alexander Jannaeus, or even Hyrcanus II. Alexander Jannaeus is especially interesting. He was both king and high priest, ruled through war and expansion, and was remembered in later Jewish sources as a deeply divisive figure. He fought internal enemies, faced rebellion, and allegedly had opponents brutally punished. If the Qumran community saw the temple leadership as violent, compromised, and willing to spill Jewish blood to preserve power, Jannaeus seems like a tempting candidate. But tempting is not the same as certain. The problem is chronology. The teacher of righteousness is also difficult to date precisely. The texts give us a drama, but not a reliable timeline with enough fixed points to solve it. One identification might explain the political power of the wicked priest, but not another detail. A different candidate might fit the calendar dispute, but not the reported persecution. Every theory has strengths. Every theory has gaps. And maybe that is why the title has endured. The wicked priest is not merely a hidden name. It is a warning about what happens when a sacred office becomes a weapon. Imagine being part of a small community watching Jerusalem from a distance. The temple still stands, sacrifices continue, pilgrims still come, priests still wear the garments of authority. From the outside, the system may appear stable, ancient, even glorious. But you believe the man at its centre is spiritually corrupt. You believe he has used the law as a tool of power. You believe he has persecuted the one teacher who understood the truth. You believe the nation is being led not toward holiness, but toward judgment. That kind of conviction changes everything. It explains why the Qumran community withdrew, why they created their own rules, their own ritual life, their own tightly controlled membership. They were not simply choosing a more private form of religion. They seem to have believed they were living through an emergency. The official guardians had failed, the true calendar had been obscured, the covenant had been violated, and the people who should have recognized the danger were following the very leaders causing it. Yet the wicked priest story contains one more strange twist. The Habakkuk Pesher does not present him as permanently untouchable. It says that he too would face judgment. The powerful priest, the pursuer, the man who seemed able to command institutions and punish opponents, would eventually be repaid for what he had done. And that raises an even more unsettling question. If the wicked priest was one corrupt leader in a specific ancient conflict, why do the scrolls describe him in a way that feels almost larger than one man? Maybe because the answer is not really about one man. Maybe the wicked priest became larger than one man because every generation knows the pattern. A leader is given authority because people believe he will protect something precious. A law, a tradition, a community, a nation, a faith. Then, slowly or sometimes suddenly, that authority begins serving itself. The language stays the same. The robes may stay the same. The institutions keep functioning, but something underneath has changed. That is why distrust of authority feels so familiar. It is not necessarily because every leader is corrupt. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not prove that, and the Qumran community was not neutral. These were deeply committed sectarian writers, convinced they possessed the correct interpretation of Scripture and that their opponents had gone dangerously astray. Their accusations were part of a bitter religious conflict. We have to remember that. We are hearing one side of an ancient argument preserved by extraordinary luck in desert caves. But one-sided testimony can still reveal a real fear. The fear is that people can be misled most effectively not by obvious enemies, but by trusted guardians. Not by someone who announces, "I have come to destroy the law," but by someone who claims to be defending it. Not by someone outside the sacred system, but by someone standing at its center. That is a much more difficult danger to recognize. Think about it. If an enemy attacks your beliefs openly, you know where you stand. You resist, you prepare, you draw a line. But what if the person speaking in the language of tradition is using that language to protect status? What if the teacher telling you to obey is exempting himself from the rules? What if the leader calling for unity really means silence? What if criticism is treated as rebellion, questions are treated as betrayal, and loyalty to God, truth, or justice becomes indistinguishable from loyalty to one powerful person? That is the world the Qumran writers believed they were living in. They saw religious authority fused with political power. They saw disputes over law and calendar become struggles over legitimacy itself. They saw a temple establishment, They considered compromised, and they concluded that the corruption was not superficial. It had reached the people entrusted with interpreting the will of God. For them, the crisis was not simply that bad people had done bad things. Bad people have always existed. The crisis was that the system could make wrongdoing look holy. That is the warning. A corrupt leader does not always remove the sacred words. Sometimes he keeps repeating them. He may quote the law, celebrate the tradition, condemn the sins of outsiders, and present himself as the only defender of order. Meanwhile, the actual demands of justice, humility, mercy, and accountability become inconvenient. They are pushed aside because they threaten power. And once that happens, ordinary people face an impossible problem. How do you know whom to trust? The scrolls offer one answer, though it is an answer shaped by their own radical worldview. Test leaders by their faithfulness, not by their position. A title does not guarantee truth. An office does not guarantee righteousness. A priest can be wicked. A teacher can mislead. A ruler can use sacred language while serving selfish ambition. That sounds obvious when stated plainly, but human beings are not naturally good at applying it. We are drawn to confidence. We like people who speak with certainty, who promise simple answers, who tell us exactly who is to blame and exactly what must be done. In chaotic times, a forceful leader can feel like safety. Complexity feels weak, doubt feels dangerous, and that is precisely when authority can become most seductive. The Qumran community responded by separating itself. They built boundaries. They examined new members. They created strict rules for behavior, purity, speech, and shared property. Whether we agree with that response or not, it shows how seriously they took the possibility of deception. They believed survival required discernment. You could not simply inherit truth from the institutions around you. You had to test it, live it, and defend it. There is a reason these ancient accusations still land with such force. We live in a world flooded with voices claiming authority. Political authority, religious authority, cultural authority, even the authority of endless information every day. Someone tells us they alone understand the crisis. Someone claims their opponents are dangerous, corrupt, blind, or evil. Sometimes those claims are propaganda. Sometimes they are warnings. Often separating one from the other takes patience that fear does not want to give us. And that brings us back to the scrolls. Their writers believed they were the faithful remnant in an age of betrayal. They may have been right about some things, wrong about others, or trapped inside conflicts we can no longer fully reconstruct. But they understood a permanent human vulnerability. Power becomes dangerous when nobody is allowed to question it. If you enjoy mysteries where the evidence is real but the answers remain disputed, there is also a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not tell us to distrust every authority automatically. That would be too simple. Communities need teachers. Societies need institutions. Traditions need people capable of preserving knowledge across generations. But the scrolls do demand something harder. They demand that authority be judged by what it produces. Does it lead people toward truth, or toward dependence on the leader? Does it protect the vulnerable, or protect the powerful? Does it allow correction, confession, and accountability? Or does it turn every question into an attack? For the people of Qumran, the answer seemed clear. The leaders in Jerusalem had failed the test, and because they had failed, judgment was coming. That conclusion was shaped by its own time, its own theology, and its own wounds. Yet the underlying question has never gone away. When the people trusted to guide a society begin using truth as a weapon, who warns the people? The next warning goes even deeper. because the scrolls do not only blame corrupt leaders. They describe a whole society being pulled apart by wealth, violence, and moral collapse. Number 5. Wealth, violence, and moral collapse. The warning begins with a sentence that sounds almost too severe to be ancient. The Damascus Document says that Israel had been caught in 3 nets of Belial. Belial, in the worldview of the scrolls, was not merely a bad influence or a symbol for temptation. He was the power of wickedness, the force pulling people away from God's covenant and into destruction. And the 3 nets were these: fornication, wealth, and the defilement of the sanctuary. That is the list, not military weakness, not foreign invasion, not a failure of technology, education, or national ambition. The crisis, according to this community, began in the human heart and spread outward through society. Sexual disorder, the corrupting pull of possessions, and sacred things treated as though they were ordinary. For the writers of the Damascus Document, these were not isolated mistakes. They were traps, nets. A net does not need to overpower you all at once. It catches you because you do not see the threads tightening until it is too late. And that image tells us something important about the people behind the scrolls. They did not believe moral collapse began when everyone suddenly chose evil. They believed it happened gradually. A boundary gets ignored, then another. A practice once considered shameful becomes normal. A warning is dismissed as extreme. People adapt. Leaders make excuses. Soon, what once troubled the conscience barely gets noticed at all. The first net named in the document is often translated as fornication, but the concern is broader than one modern word can capture. The Qumran writers were obsessed with covenant boundaries, especially boundaries around marriage, family, and ritual purity. They condemned relationships they considered unlawful. They criticized divorce practices. They condemned taking more than one wife, arguing from the creation story that God made humanity male and female, one pair joined together from the beginning. Now, historians should be careful here. The Damascus Document does not give us a neutral survey of Jewish life in the first century before and after the Common Era. It gives us the perspective of a strict religious movement, one that believed other Jews had compromised the law. Their rules were unusually demanding, and their interpretation was not accepted by everyone. But their intensity is revealing. They saw the family not as a private space beyond moral scrutiny, but as one of the places where a society either preserved its covenant or quietly abandoned it. If people could reshape marriage, desire, and loyalty around whatever seemed convenient, then the writers feared that every other command would eventually become negotiable too. That was their logic. The issue was never just private behavior. It was whether human appetite had become stronger than obedience. Then comes the second net: wealth. The text uses language that can be translated as riches, money, or unjust gain. And the wording matters. The writers were not necessarily condemning every possession or every successful household. Their concern was what wealth could do when it stopped being a tool and became a master. Because wealth changes the moral weather around a person. It can make compromise feel practical. It can make exploitation look like business. It can make people defend systems they would once have called cruel, simply because those systems now benefit them. And perhaps most dangerously, it can teach a person to confuse comfort with innocence. The Damascus Document sees that danger clearly. It speaks of people being ensnared by wealth, as though money does not simply sit in a bag or a storehouse. It reaches into judgment. It alters loyalties. It changes what a person is willing to overlook. Think about how subtle that can be. Nobody wakes up and says, "Today I will trade my conscience for security." It happens in smaller decisions. You see something wrong, but speaking would cost you. You know someone is being treated unfairly, but the arrangement helps your family. You tell yourself it is not your responsibility. You tell yourself everyone does it. You tell yourself the world is complicated, and maybe it is. But the scrolls ask an uncomfortable question. At what point does complexity become an excuse? The third net is the defilement of the sanctuary. To modern ears, this may sound remote. A dispute about ancient purity laws, priestly practice, sacrifices, and temple ritual. But to the Qumran community, the sanctuary was not just a building in Jerusalem. It represented the centre of the covenant between God and the people. If the sacred centre was polluted, then the whole nation was in danger. They believed the temple authorities had allowed improper practices, improper offerings, and improper interpretations to enter a place that was supposed to be holy. Whether every accusation was fair is impossible to know. The surviving texts come from their side of the conflict. But their fear was unmistakable. When a society treats its highest commitments as negotiable, what is left that cannot be bought, bent, or ignored? That question leads directly into the darker side of the warning. Because once wealth, appetite, and compromised sacred authority take hold, the Damascus Document says the damage does not remain private for long. It begins showing up in the way people treat one another. And this is where the Damascus Document becomes even more disturbing, because it does not treat unjust wealth and violence as separate problems. They belong together. In the world of the scrolls, violence was not only a man raising a weapon against another man. Of course, murder mattered. Bloodshed mattered. The community's rules took oaths, testimony, property, and bodily harm with extreme seriousness. But violence could also be built into ordinary arrangements. It could happen when the powerful took what did not belong to them, when judges bent decisions, when debt became a tool for crushing the weak, when a person saw another human being as a source of profit instead of a neighbour under God's protection. That is the logic behind the warning. Forbidden wealth was dangerous not merely because someone had too much. It was dangerous because unjust gain usually has a victim even when that victim has no voice in the room. Somebody was underpaid. Somebody was cheated. Somebody lost land, inheritance, security, or dignity. Somebody was forced to carry the cost of another person's comfort. And the people benefiting from the system could always find a reason not to see it. That is how moral collapse works on a larger scale. Not through one dramatic act of cruelty, but through countless smaller acts that become normal because they are profitable. A dishonest measure at the market, a false promise in an agreement, a loan designed to trap rather than help, a court ruling that somehow always favours the well-connected, a religious leader accepting gifts from the very people he should be willing to challenge. None of these things needs to look like violence at first, but follow them far enough, and violence is exactly what they become. Picture a farmer in ancient Judea, one bad harvest, then another. He borrows grain or silver to get through the season. The lender has security. The lender has witnesses. The lender understands the terms better than the desperate man standing across from him. Soon the debt grows. Land that had supported a family for generations changes hands. The farmer becomes dependent on the estate of someone who became richer during his disaster. No sword needed to be drawn. No army had to invade. Yet a life has been broken open. We cannot assume every line in the Damascus Document refers to one specific transaction or one single class of wealthy offenders. The text is often forceful, sometimes cryptic, and written from within a bitter religious conflict. But its moral framework is clear enough. A community cannot claim faithfulness while allowing greed, deception, and harm to govern its relationships. For these writers, injustice was not an unfortunate side effect of a complicated economy. It was evidence of rebellion, And that is a much harder accusation to hear, because it means the question is not simply, did anyone break a law? The deeper question is, what kind of people are we becoming when gain matters more than mercy? The scrolls repeatedly return to this idea that hidden motives eventually become public consequences. A person covets what belongs to another, then he manipulates. He deceives, he uses power, and eventually the damage spreads beyond his own household. Trust disappears. Neighbours become rivals. The vulnerable learn that promises are meaningless. Those with power learn that they can act without restraint. At that point, a society may still look stable from the outside. Markets continue. Leaders give speeches. Religious ceremonies continue. Families go about daily life. But underneath, something essential has started to rot. The Qumran community believed this rot was already visible in their own world. They saw rival teachers, compromised authorities, and a Jerusalem establishment they believed had abandoned the true path. Their language could be harsh because they were convinced the stakes were final. In their view, the people were not simply making imperfect choices in difficult times. They were storing up judgment by treating oppression as ordinary. And notice the order of the warning. Wealth comes before violence in the list of dangers surrounding this community's worldview. That does not mean money automatically causes bloodshed, but it recognizes something painfully realistic. Greed trains the heart to calculate other people's value. Once that calculation takes over, cruelty becomes easier. The suffering of another person is no longer a moral emergency. It becomes a cost of doing business, an inconvenience, a statistic, someone else's problem. That is why unjust wealth is never really private. It reaches outward. It changes households, courts, places of worship, and eventually entire communities. It creates people who have too much to lose by telling the truth. And once truth becomes expensive, lies begin to feel necessary. There is a book on the website about 12 unexplained mysteries, available through the link in the description. But keep this ancient warning in mind, because the mystery here is not why societies become corrupt. The scrolls would say the pattern is almost predictable. First, people learn to excuse what benefits them. Then they learn to protect it. Then they learn to punish anyone who threatens to expose it. And that is where wealth turns into something more than wealth. It becomes power. Not just the power to buy things, but the power to shape what others are allowed to say, believe and do. For the Damascus Document, that was the point where violence stopped being an occasional crime and became part of the moral atmosphere. And that is why this warning still feels uncomfortably current. Not because the Damascus Document predicted stock markets, digital currencies, corporate monopolies, political campaigns, or global supply chains. It did not. The writers in the Judean wilderness knew nothing about our technology, our institutions, or the scale of the modern economy. But they understood something about human beings. They understood that a society can become morally numb long before it becomes visibly destroyed. It happens when people stop asking whether something is right and start asking only whether it works, whether it is legal, whether it is profitable, whether everyone else is doing it, whether there is enough distance between the decision and the suffering that follows. That distance is one of the great powers of the modern world. A person can buy something without knowing who made it, invest money without knowing what that money supports, share a headline without checking whether it is true, celebrate a public figure without asking what kind of behavior put that person on top. We are surrounded by systems so large and complicated that responsibility can seem to disappear inside them. And sometimes it does, not literally. The consequences remain. The victim remains. The damage remains. But the sense of personal responsibility disappears. The Damascus Document would likely have recognized that as a danger immediately. Its writers believed that God saw through the excuses people used to protect themselves. A community could hide behind ritual, tradition, titles, and public respectability. It could say the right words and keep the right calendar. But if its members were devoted to gain, deception, and self-interest, then the outward appearance of faithfulness meant very little. That is the part that reaches across 2,000 years. We live in an age filled with information, yet often starved for moral clarity. Every day brings another story of exploitation, corruption, cruelty, or public dishonesty, and almost every story produces the same reaction. Outrage for a moment, arguments over who is to blame. Then the next story arrives, and the previous one disappears beneath it. The scrolls offer no easy comfort here. They suggest that repeated exposure to wrongdoing can change a people. At first, evil shocks us. Then it becomes familiar. Then it becomes political. Then it becomes profitable. And eventually people begin defending the very things that once would have horrified them. That is moral collapse, not everyone suddenly becoming a villain. Not a city waking up one morning and deciding to become violent, greedy, or corrupt. It is slower than that, more ordinary, more dangerous. It is the gradual lowering of the line. The lie that seemed unacceptable last year becomes understandable this year. The cruelty that once caused outrage becomes necessary. The abuse of power becomes strategy. The suffering of strangers becomes background noise. And the people who still object are treated as naive, disloyal, extreme, or inconvenient. The Qumran community believed they were living through exactly that kind of moment. Whether every one of their accusations against rivals was fair is impossible to know. These were deeply committed people writing from inside an intense religious conflict. They had enemies, they had grievances, they saw themselves as a faithful remnant surrounded by compromise. So we should be careful not to treat their words as a simple newspaper report from ancient Judea. But their warning does not depend on every accusation being historically precise. The deeper insight is still there. Communities break down when they lose the ability to feel shame, when wealth becomes proof of virtue, when power becomes proof of truth, when success becomes proof that God must approve. That last idea may be the most dangerous of all. Because once people believe prosperity automatically proves righteousness, they no longer have to examine how that prosperity was gained. They do not have to look at the people left behind. They do not have to ask whether their comfort depends on another person's desperation. They can call the result blessing and move on. The Damascus Document refuses to let its readers do that. It insists that the hidden moral condition of a people matters more than the image they project. A nation can be wealthy and sick, powerful and unstable, religious and deeply corrupt. It can build impressive institutions while quietly destroying trust between human beings. Think about that. Trust is not dramatic. It does not make headlines until it is gone. But every society depends on it. You trust that a contract means something, that a court will hear evidence fairly, that a doctor is trying to help you, that a teacher is telling the truth, that a neighbour will not harm you, that a leader's promises are more than carefully designed words. When those assumptions collapse, people do not simply become disappointed. They become fearful, suspicious, isolated. They begin protecting themselves because they no longer believe anyone else will. And once enough people live that way, the whole society changes. The scrolls describe judgment in the language of their own ancient worldview. Divine visitation, reckoning, separation between those who remain faithful and those who refuse correction. Different readers will understand that language differently. Some will see a literal warning about the end of an age. Others will see a spiritual pattern repeated throughout history. But either way, the challenge is clear. What happens when a culture refuses correction? What happens when greed is rewarded, truth is treated as weakness, and violence is excused as long as it benefits the right side? The answer, according to the Damascus Document, is not that disaster suddenly falls from nowhere. The disaster has already begun. It begins in the heart, then in the home, then in the marketplace, then in the courts, the temples, the halls of power, and the stories people tell to justify themselves. That is why this ancient warning still feels so close. It is not only asking what evil people are doing somewhere else. It is asking what we have learned to tolerate. And before moving on, that may be the hardest question the scrolls leave behind. If moral collapse arrives gradually, disguised as normal life, would we even recognize it while it was happening? Number 6. False interpretation of sacred law. If the previous warning was about a society learning to tolerate moral collapse, this one goes even deeper. What happens when people use sacred truth itself to justify the collapse? For the community at Qumran, this was not some minor argument about religious preferences. It was not a disagreement over music, clothing, or which teacher gave the most impressive speeches. They believed the right understanding of God's law was a matter of life and death, a matter of covenant, a matter of whether a people could remain faithful when the rest of the world was drifting away. That sounds extreme to modern ears, but to understand the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have to understand the world these writers inhabited. For ancient Jews, the Torah was not simply a book of private spiritual advice. It was the foundation of a whole way of life. It shaped worship, family, work, justice, food, purity, community obligations, and the relationship between the people and their God. To interpret the law was to answer the biggest questions a community could ask. Who belongs? What does faithfulness look like? How should power be used? What does justice require? What happens when tradition and convenience begin pulling people in opposite directions? The people behind the scrolls believed that these questions had been answered wrongly by many of their contemporaries. In texts like the Damascus Document and the Community Rule, they describe a world in which people had wandered from the proper path. They accused opponents of seeking smooth things, a phrase that seems to mean teachings made easier, softer, more appealing, more convenient than the strict demands they believed God had given. And that is where the warning becomes uncomfortable. Because false interpretation, in their view, did not begin with someone openly rejecting God. It began with someone claiming to honor God while quietly changing what obedience required. Picture the situation. You have a sacred text handed down through generations. Everyone agrees it is holy. Everyone quotes it. Everyone claims loyalty to it. But they do not all agree on what it means when real life becomes complicated. A ruler makes a decision. A priest grants an exception. A respected teacher explains away an inconvenient command. A wealthy person finds a religious argument for keeping what should have been shared. A community adopts practices that seem reasonable, popular, even compassionate in the moment. And slowly, almost invisibly, the words remain the same while their force begins to change. That was the danger the Qumran writers saw all around them. They did not think sacred law could protect a community automatically. Merely possessing it was not enough. Hearing it was not enough. Reciting it was not enough. Even performing religious rituals was not enough. What mattered was whether people understood God's will correctly and then actually lived by it. That belief explains why interpretation mattered so much at Qumran. The community did not see itself as inventing a new religion out in the wilderness. They saw themselves as recovering an ancient truth that others had neglected. They believed God had revealed the proper way to understand the covenant through a figure they called the teacher of righteousness. We do not know with certainty who that teacher was. The scrolls do not give us a name we can prove. Scholars have proposed possibilities, but the evidence remains incomplete. What is clear is that the community treated this teacher as someone who had opened up the hidden meaning of Scripture for a time of crisis. Not hidden in the sense of secret codes predicting modern events. Hidden in the sense that sacred writings required faithful interpretation. The words had to be read carefully, applied seriously, and protected from leaders or institutions that might bend them towards status, wealth, or political convenience. For the Qumran community, Scripture was alive. It was speaking about their own age. Ancient warnings against unfaithfulness were not just stories about people long dead. They were mirrors held up to the present. When they read about Israel wandering, rebelling, ignoring prophets, or making compromises with surrounding powers, they believed those patterns could happen again. In fact, they believed they were happening again. That is one reason the scrolls still feel current. Every generation inherits important words, religious words, legal words, national promises, moral principles, words about freedom, justice, dignity, truth, and responsibility. But words do not interpret themselves. People interpret them. Institutions interpret them. Leaders interpret them. And often the people with the most power are the ones best positioned to decide which parts get emphasized and which parts quietly disappear. If you are interested in these kinds of unanswered historical questions, there is also a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description now. The Qumran writers would not have recognized our modern debates in their details. They lived under entirely different conditions, with different political structures, different technologies, and a different religious world. We should not pretend the Dead Sea Scrolls are secretly commenting on our headlines. But the human pattern is familiar. A teaching begins as a challenge to selfishness. Then someone explains why the challenge does not apply in this particular case. A command meant to protect the vulnerable becomes an obstacle to efficiency. A principle meant to restrain power gets reworded until it protects power instead. And the people making those changes may not always see themselves as corrupt. They may believe they are being practical. They may believe they are preserving stability. They may believe they are defending tradition. That is what makes interpretation so powerful. It can guide people toward justice, or it can give injustice a sacred vocabulary. At Qumran, the community believed the battle over interpretation was already a battle for the soul of the nation. And nowhere was that battle more visible than in arguments over the law itself. Not the broad commandments everyone already knew, not the obvious prohibitions against murder, theft, or idolatry. The deepest conflicts appeared in the details, the difficult cases, the questions where a single ruling could affect the temple, the calendar, the food people ate, the marriages they made, the money they gave, and the days they considered holy. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls become surprisingly specific. One of the most important texts is known as 4QMMT, a title formed from its Hebrew words, usually translated something like some works of the law. It appears to preserve a letter or legal statement addressed to people outside the community. Its writers lay out a series of disputed rulings. The tone is not casual. They believe these matters are serious enough to separate the faithful from those they see as corrupting the covenant. Some disputes involved temple purity. What happens if a person who is ritually impure comes into contact with sacred food? How should offerings be handled? What kinds of animals, liquids, vessels, or materials can become contaminated? When does impurity pass from one thing to another? These might sound like obscure technical questions now, but in a society centered on temple worship, they were not technical at all. They determined whether worship was acceptable. They determined whether priests were serving properly. They determined whether the most sacred space in the nation was being protected or defiled. Imagine two groups reading the same ancient law and reaching different conclusions. One says, this practice preserves purity. The other says, no, that practice violates purity. Neither side thinks it is debating a small administrative issue. Each side believes the other is putting the entire relationship between God and the people at risk. That is the intensity behind these scrolls. And then there was the calendar. For the Qumran community, time itself had become a religious battlefield. Today, calendars can feel like simple tools. You check your phone, see the date, make an appointment, move on. But ancient calendars controlled the rhythm of public life. They told people when festivals began, when sacrifices were offered, when priests served, when harvest celebrations took place, and when the entire community gathered before God. Get the calendar wrong, and from the Qumran perspective, you could be worshipping on the wrong day. You could be observing a feast after the moment God had appointed. You could have priests carrying out sacred duties at times the heavenly order did not authorize. The scrolls strongly favor a 364-day calendar. It was a solar calendar arranged in a highly regular pattern, 52 weeks, 4 seasons and months that followed a stable order. Because 364 divides evenly by 7, major festivals could fall on the same day of the week each year. The system had a kind of mathematical elegance, orderly, predictable, almost cosmic, for a community obsessed with the difference between obedience and drift. That order mattered. They seem to have viewed the calendar not as a human convenience, but as part of the structure of creation. The sun, moon, seasons and festivals were not random. They were governed by God. To preserve the proper calendar was to align earthly worship with a heavenly pattern. But many other Jews of the period used calendars tied more closely to lunar months, with adjustments added to keep festivals in their proper seasons. That approach was practical and widespread. It also had deep roots in Jewish tradition. So we should be careful here. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us the Qumran community's view of the conflict, not a neutral recording of every side. Still, from their perspective, the disagreement was alarming. They believed other groups had abandoned the true calendar. And if the calendar was wrong, the consequences were enormous. The wrong priests might serve at the wrong time. The wrong sacrifices might be offered on the wrong dates. A holy festival might be observed while the community believed heaven itself was marking an ordinary day. Picture it. One group gathers for a sacred feast. Prayers are spoken. Food is prepared. Rituals are performed. The people believe they are keeping the appointed time. But a smaller community, watching from the outside, says, "You are late," or worse. You are not celebrating God's feast at all. You are celebrating a date created by human error. That is a powerful accusation. And it helps explain why the Qumran community was willing to live apart from the dominant religious system. Their separation was not necessarily because they disliked public life or wanted to be mysterious. They believed the public religious order had gone off course at a level so fundamental that joining in could make them participants in the error. The calendar dispute also reveals something deeper about their worldview. They did not see history as loose, shapeless, or controlled by whoever held power in Jerusalem. They saw time as ordered. Festivals had their place. Priestly courses had their place. Sabbaths had their place. Human beings had a place within a moral universe that was already structured by divine command. And when people altered that structure, even with arguments that sounded reasonable, the Qumran writers saw more than a scheduling disagreement. They saw rebellion disguised as interpretation. The same pattern appeared in other legal debates. Texts from the caves discuss questions involving marriage, vows, property, agricultural produce, ritual washing, and the handling of offerings. Scholars continue to debate exactly how each ruling relates to other Jewish groups of the period. The evidence is fragmentary, and the language can be difficult. But the larger picture is clear enough. The community believed law reached into ordinary life. It was not reserved for scholars arguing in a distant chamber. It followed people into kitchens, fields, family decisions, business dealings, and worship. Every ruling carried a question beneath it. Are we shaping our lives around the covenant? Or are we reshaping the covenant around our lives? That question did not disappear with the ancient world, because the hardest arguments are rarely about whether values matter. Almost everyone says they matter. The real struggle begins when those values become costly, when a calendar disrupts commerce, when a holy day interferes with politics, when a command limits profit, when a rule exposes a powerful institution, when following the text as one understands it means standing apart from the crowd. And that is where the Qumran community's warning becomes even more unsettling. They believed error did not always arrive as open defiance. Sometimes it arrived with a learned argument, an official ruling, and complete confidence that the compromise was faithfulness. That may be the most dangerous kind of error, not the error that announces itself as rebellion, not the person who says, "I do not care what is true." Those dangers are easier to recognize. At least they are honest about the conflict. The harder danger is certainty without humility. It is the conviction that your interpretation is so obviously correct that no question can be asked. No evidence can complicate it. No criticism can be heard. No reminder of human limitation can get through. The Qumran community was certain that many of their opponents had distorted the covenant. Their writings can be fierce, even absolute. They speak of people who seek smooth things, a phrase scholars often understand as a criticism of teachers who made the law easier, more flexible, or more convenient than the community believed it should be. But this is where we have to slow down. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not a transcript from heaven explaining every dispute. They are the writings of real people, living in a volatile period, reading inherited sacred texts, defending convictions, and seeing opponents through the pressure of conflict. They preserve a powerful perspective. They do not give us every perspective. And that distinction matters, because a community can be right that compromise is dangerous, while still becoming trapped by its own certainty. A group can recognize corruption in the world around it and still confuse its own customs, fears, leaders, or assumptions with the voice of God. That is not just an ancient problem. It may be one of the oldest traps in human history. Think about how certainty works. At first, it can feel like strength. A person faces confusion, competing voices, moral chaos, and constant pressure to bend. Clear conviction feels solid. It gives order to a complicated world. It tells you where to stand, and sometimes standing firm is exactly what is needed. But certainty becomes dangerous when it stops asking whether it has understood correctly, when the goal shifts from seeking truth to defending a side, when a person no longer reads a sacred text to be challenged by it, but only to find weapons against everyone else. When disagreement becomes proof that the other person is wicked, ignorant, corrupt, or beyond redemption, that is when interpretation turns into something else. It becomes identity, power, a fortress, and once a belief becomes a fortress, every uncomfortable question starts to look like an enemy attack. The people behind the Dead Sea Scrolls knew what it meant to live under pressure. They believed the religious establishment had failed. They believed powerful leaders had compromised what was holy. They believed the majority could be deeply wrong. History gives us plenty of reasons not to dismiss that concern. Majorities can be wrong. Institutions can become self-protective. Religious language can be used to bless what should be confronted. But the scrolls also leave us with an unsettling mirror. If we are so sure everyone else has abandoned the truth, have we left room for the possibility that we too are limited? That we may be seeing only part of the picture? That zeal, even sincere zeal, can harden into blindness. This does not mean all interpretations are equally sound. It does not mean convictions are useless, or that truth is impossible to know. The Qumran writers would have rejected that idea completely. Their entire life was built around the belief that faithfulness required discernment. The warning is more demanding than vague tolerance. It is this: hold convictions firmly enough to live by them, but humbly enough to be corrected. That balance is difficult. Maybe that is why it is rare. And it becomes even harder in an age where every opinion can find an audience. Today, people do not need to enter a temple court or study under a recognized teacher to present themselves as an authority. A confident voice, a short clip, a dramatic headline, and suddenly an interpretation can travel across the world before anyone asks where it came from. The old danger has acquired new tools. A complicated text gets reduced to a slogan. A difficult historical question gets turned into a certainty. A verse, a tradition, or a sacred law gets pulled from its setting and used to prove whatever a community already wanted to believe. And because the message is repeated thousands of times, repetition starts to feel like evidence. That is not discernment, that is momentum. If you want to explore more mysteries where the evidence is real but the answers are still debated, there is a book on the website about 12 unexplained mysteries. The link is in the description. It is a reminder that not every important question comes with an easy answer, and that uncertainty is not the same thing as ignorance. The Qumran community would likely have found our world familiar in one uncomfortable way. We are surrounded by interpretation. Everyone has an explanation. Everyone has a warning. Everyone knows who is corrupt, who is deceived, who has compromised, and who alone has remained faithful. But the scrolls push us to ask a harder question. What happens when we become so focused on identifying false teachers that we stop examining our own hearts? What happens when defending sacred law becomes more important than mercy, honesty, repentance, and justice? What happens when being right becomes the highest good? The answer, according to the moral universe reflected in these texts, is that religious error can become almost invisible. It can wear the language of purity. It can quote ancient authority. It can claim to protect the faithful. And all the while, it can be moving people further from the very truth it claims to defend. That is why humility is not weakness. Humility is the safeguard against turning faith into a weapon. It is the willingness to say, I must be faithful to what I understand, but I am not God. I must test my motives. I must hear correction. I must never use certainty as an excuse to stop seeking truth. For the community at Qumran, false interpretation was not merely an intellectual mistake. It was a spiritual danger with consequences for an entire generation. And their final warning is still sharp. The greatest deception may not be abandoning what is sacred. It may be believing you have protected it, long after you have stopped listening. 7. Prepare before the day of visitation. After all the warnings about corruption, false teaching, violence, and hidden compromise, the people behind the Dead Sea Scrolls believed history was moving toward a moment when God would intervene. They called it the Day of Visitation, and that phrase is more unsettling than it first sounds. Today, visitation can sound gentle. A visit from a friend, a visit from family, someone arriving at your door because they want to see you. But in the biblical world, a visitation could mean something very different. It meant that God had come to inspect, to confront, to judge, to act. The ancient Hebrew idea behind the word is connected to being noticed, counted, examined, called to account. It could describe God visiting people with mercy, deliverance, blessing, or restoration. But it could also describe punishment, a reckoning, the moment when hidden things are no longer hidden because the judge has arrived. And for the Qumran community, that moment was not an abstract theological idea. They believed it was coming, not eventually in some distant future too far away to affect ordinary life. They read their own troubled age as evidence that history had entered its final phase. The land was under foreign rule. Priestly leadership was disputed. Different Jewish groups accused one another of betraying the covenant. Violence, political power, religious conflict, and apocalyptic expectation were all woven together. To the people living near Qumran, this was not simply a difficult time. It was a sign. They believed the world around them was revealing what had always been underneath. The faithful and the unfaithful were being exposed. The rulers of darkness were gathering strength. Those who claimed authority were leading people astray. And soon God would visit history in a way no human institution could prevent. That is the meaning of the day of visitation. It is the day when delay ends, the day when appearances stop protecting people, the day when wealth cannot purchase safety, rank cannot guarantee innocence, and public reputation cannot cover private corruption. Think about how much of human life depends on time. Time lets people postpone difficult decisions. Time lets institutions ignore problems. Time lets a leader make promises without being tested by results. Time lets a person say, "I will deal with that later. I will change later. I will tell the truth later. I will become serious later." But the day of visitation, as the scrolls imagine it, is the end of later. It is the moment when later becomes now. That is why the language of these texts can feel so intense. They do not picture history as an endless cycle where one crisis follows another, and everything simply continues. They picture history moving toward an appointment, a fixed moment known to God, even if unknown to human beings. In some of the scrolls, especially the commentaries known as Pesharim, ancient biblical prophecies are read as coded messages about the writer's own time. Habakkuk, Isaiah, Nahum, the Psalms, and other sacred texts were not only records of the past, they were maps of the present. A prophet speaks about arrogant rulers, and the Qumran reader asks, "Who are those rulers now?" A prophet speaks about wickedness flourishing for a season, and the reader asks, "Are we living in that season?" A prophet speaks about judgment coming suddenly, and the reader asks, "How close are we?" This does not mean we can prove that every Qumran author expected the exact same event on the exact same timetable. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a library, not one single book. They preserve different genres, different concerns, and likely different stages in the life of a community. Scholars debate how unified their expectations were and exactly which events they believed were imminent. But the larger pattern is hard to miss. They saw themselves as living before divine intervention. They believed history had a moral structure. They believed evil could appear successful without being secure. And they believed God's patience should never be mistaken for God's approval. That last point may be the one that still feels most current. Because when injustice lasts a long time, people start treating it as permanent. When corrupt leaders remain powerful, people assume power is proof. When lies spread without consequence, people begin to wonder whether truth has any force at all. When the world keeps moving after another scandal, another betrayal, another act of cruelty, it becomes easy to believe that nobody is watching. The Qumran writers rejected that conclusion completely. They believed someone was watching, not with the distracted attention of a human audience that moves on to the next outrage by tomorrow morning. Not with the shallow attention of a crowd that can be manipulated by confidence, spectacle, and propaganda. They believed God saw the hidden structure beneath events. The deal nobody knew about, the judgment quietly sold for influence. The sacred language used to cover selfish ambition. the suffering dismissed because it was inconvenient, the loyalty performed in public while betrayal was planned in private. And they believed a day would come when all of it would be brought into the light. That is a terrifying idea if you benefit from darkness. But it is also a source of hope if you have watched darkness seem untouchable. Because the day of visitation means history is not abandoned. It means evil does not get the final word simply because it has held the microphone for a long time. It means the powerful are not beyond examination. It means the forgotten are not unseen. Still, there is a problem. If the day is coming, what is a person supposed to do before it arrives? For the people behind the Dead Sea Scrolls, the answer was not to panic. It was to prepare. And preparation began with a word that has become almost too familiar to hear clearly: repentance. Today, repentance can sound like a vague feeling. Feeling bad, regretting something, posting an apology after getting caught, saying you are sorry, then returning to exactly the same habits the moment the pressure fades. But that is not what repentance meant at Qumran. For them, repentance meant turning around. It meant recognizing that you were walking in the wrong direction and changing your path before the road reached its end. Not just correcting a mistake, not just managing appearances, reordering your life around obedience to God. The community rule, one of the most important texts found among the scrolls, describes a group built around this kind of turning. Its members were expected to seek God with their whole heart and soul. They were to separate themselves from what the text considered injustice, study the law, confess wrongdoing, accept correction, and submit to a demanding shared way of life. That language can sound severe to modern ears, and it was severe. This was not a casual spiritual circle where everyone showed up when convenient, agreed to disagree, and went home unchanged. The community imagined in these texts required commitment. There were rules about speech, rules about work, rules about money, rules about meals, rules about how members treated one another, rules about who could participate fully in the community and when. A person did not simply announce, "I am one of you now," and receive instant acceptance. There was a process. New members could spend years being tested before gaining full access to communal life. Their character was observed. Their conduct mattered. Their willingness to learn mattered. Their ability to accept discipline mattered. Because the Qumran writers did not think a person became ready for God's judgment by memorizing the right ideas. They thought readiness had to become visible, in the way you spoke when nobody important was listening, in the way you handled possessions, in whether you told the truth when lying would protect you, in whether you accepted correction or immediately found someone else to blame. That is where purity enters the story, and purity in the Dead Sea Scrolls was never just about dirt. The community practiced ritual washings, immersions in water that modern visitors can still see evidence of around the Qumran site. But the texts make something crucially clear. Water by itself could not cleanse a person who remained committed to wrongdoing. You could wash your body again and again. You could enter the water at sunrise. You could know every prayer, every rule, every sacred phrase. But if your heart remained proud, dishonest, violent, greedy, or rebellious, the washing meant nothing. That is a hard idea, because rituals can be easier than change. A ritual has edges. You perform it. You complete it. You can tell yourself the obligation has been met. But repentance has no such easy boundary. It reaches into motives. It asks why you said what you said, why you wanted what you wanted, why you stayed silent when you knew something was wrong, why you defended a lie because the lie benefited your side. The Qumran community believed impurity could begin long before it showed up in public behavior. It could grow in secret, in a divided mind, in what the texts often call a stubborn or crooked heart. And that is why their discipline was so intense. They believed small compromises were not small. A careless word could become a pattern. A hidden resentment could become rebellion. A private act of greed could poison the trust holding an entire community together. In their view, evil did not usually arrive wearing a name tag that said evil. It arrived as an exception, just this once. Nobody will know. Everyone does it. You deserve this. You can make it right later. That word again, later. The Dead Sea Scrolls push back against later because later is where discipline goes to die. Later is where repentance becomes a plan that never reaches the calendar. Later is where a person keeps postponing the one decision that might actually change them. And maybe that is why these ancient writings still hit such a nerve. We live in a world with endless tools for self-improvement, but very few systems that reward honest self-examination. We can track our sleep, our spending, our calories, our productivity, our followers. But measuring the condition of the heart is harder. It requires silence, it requires humility, it requires admitting that the problem may not always be outside of us. And if you're drawn to these questions, the mysteries history leaves behind, and the strange patterns that refuse to fit easy explanations, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description now. It is important to be careful here. The people associated with the scrolls were not offering a modern program for individual wellness. Their rules belonged to a specific ancient Jewish world, shaped by covenant, temple debates, biblical law and expectations that God would soon set things right. We should not flatten their practices into a generic lesson about being a better person. But the challenge underneath them is difficult to escape. What would it mean to live as if character is preparation? What would it mean to treat integrity not as a public image, but as a form of readiness? For Qumran, discipline was not punishment for its own sake. At least in principle, it was training. The community was trying to become the kind of people who could stand before God without hiding behind status, wealth, religious performance, or the approval of the crowd. That is why correction was built into their life together. And that is also where their vision became both powerful and dangerous. A community built around correction can protect people from self-deception. But it can also become dangerous when the people doing the correcting become convinced they can never be wrong. That tension runs straight through the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Qumran writings are full of confidence. Their authors believed history was moving toward a decisive moment. God had not abandoned the world. Evil was not going to rule forever. Corrupt leaders, violent nations, false teachers, and the people they saw as traitors to the covenant would not have the final word. A day was coming when hidden things would be exposed. The righteous would be vindicated, and the order of the world would be set right. That was the hope, but hope in these texts came with a warning sharp enough to cut. Because the writers did not only expect judgment for obvious enemies, they warned their own people. They warned those who claimed to know the law, those who performed the rituals, those who held authority, those who assumed that being part of the right group meant they were automatically safe. The danger was not simply being outside the community. The danger was belonging outwardly, while remaining unchanged within. That is one reason the Dead Sea Scrolls still feel so current. Nearly every generation has people who can identify everything wrong with the world around them. Corrupt politicians, hypocritical religious figures, greedy institutions, violent movements, moral decay everywhere they look. But the Qumran writings force a more uncomfortable question. What if judgment begins with the people most certain they understand it? What if the person warning everyone else about darkness has stopped examining their own heart? For the scroll's authors, apocalyptic expectation was not supposed to create spectators. It was supposed to create responsibility. If God was going to intervene in history, then every day before that intervention mattered. Every choice mattered. Every act of loyalty or betrayal mattered. The future was not just something to predict, it was something to prepare for. And that preparation gave suffering a strange kind of meaning. The community behind the scrolls seems to have felt isolated, outnumbered, and rejected by much of the wider society. They believed the institutions that should have guided Israel had become compromised. They believed powerful people had distorted sacred truth. They believed they were living in an age of confusion, when darkness could speak in the language of light and deception could wear the clothing of holiness. That sounds dramatic, but from their perspective, it was not drama. It was explanation. It explained why the world looked so wrong while God still seemed silent. The silence was not absence. The delay was not defeat. History was moving toward an appointed end, even if human beings could not see the entire path. That belief could give people incredible endurance. If you think evil is temporary, you do not have to surrender to it. If you think justice is real, you can refuse to become cynical when injustice appears to win. If you think God sees what rulers, crowds, and institutions ignore, then your faith does not have to depend on immediate results. That is the hopeful side of apocalyptic expectation. It says the present moment is not the whole story. It says cruelty is not eternal. It says lies can dominate for a season without becoming truth. But there is another side. A belief that the end is near can make people patient and courageous. It can also make them rigid. It can divide the world into the pure and the condemned so completely that compassion disappears. It can turn disagreement into proof of evil. It can make a community so focused on the coming judgment that it loses the ability to see its own failures in the present. And historians have to be honest about that. The Qumran sectarians were not neutral observers standing above the conflicts of their age. They were participants in them. Their writings preserve a fierce moral vision, but also deep hostility toward those they considered enemies. We cannot know every detail of their daily life or every group behind every scroll. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a library, not a single voice. But the sectarian texts clearly show a people who believed the line between faithfulness and betrayal had become urgent. Maybe that is why their final warning matters. Do not wait until the crisis arrives to decide who you are. Do not assume that future justice excuses present compromise. Do not confuse knowing the language of righteousness with living it. The people of Qumran expected God to act in history. They may have been wrong about the timing. They may have misunderstood some of the enemies they thought they saw. But their central challenge remains difficult to dismiss. A world in crisis does not only reveal what leaders are made of, it reveals what ordinary people have been practicing all along. And when the day of testing comes, whatever form it takes, preparation will not begin then. It will reveal whether it began long before, and that may be the deepest message hidden inside these ancient warnings. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not give us a simple calendar for the end of the world. They do not allow us to point at one headline, one war, one leader, one disaster and say with certainty, this is it. That is not what they are. They are the writings of real people living in a turbulent period of history. People under foreign rule. People watching religious institutions fight for power. People disturbed by violence, wealth, hypocrisy, compromise, and the feeling that the world they knew was slipping away. They believed they were living near the end of an age. Maybe they were wrong about exactly how and when history would reach its final turning point. But the questions they asked have not gone away. What happens when a generation becomes so used to corruption that it stops being shocked by it? What happens when leaders speak sacred words while serving themselves? What happens when people can recognize evil in every enemy, but cannot recognize it in their own desires? What happens when wealth increases, violence spreads, truth becomes negotiable, and public morality turns into a performance? Those are not ancient questions. Those are our questions. The first warning was about the final generation, not as a date on a timeline, but as a condition of the human heart. A generation becomes final when it reaches a point where warning no longer leads to change, when people hear the truth, understand the truth, maybe even repeat the truth, and still choose the path that destroys them. That is terrifying because it means the danger is not ignorance alone. Sometimes the danger is knowing better. The second warning was about Belial, the force of deception and rebellion in the sectarian imagination. Whether someone reads Belial as a literal supernatural enemy, a symbol of evil, or both, the warning remains powerful. Destruction does not always arrive looking destructive. Sometimes it arrives as permission. Permission to hate. Permission to lie. Permission to excuse what you once knew was wrong. Permission to believe that your side is so righteous that anything done in its name becomes acceptable. That is how darkness becomes difficult to recognize. It does not always ask people to abandon their values. Sometimes it simply teaches them to weaponize those values against everyone else. Then came the warning about the war between light and darkness. The people behind some of these scrolls imagined history as a cosmic conflict. There were forces of truth and forces of falsehood. Loyalty mattered. Character mattered. The choices made in private mattered. But this was never supposed to be an excuse for paranoia or cruelty. That is where the warning becomes especially important for modern listeners. If you believe the world is divided between light and darkness, you have to begin by asking where darkness might be operating in you. In your anger, in your pride, in your hunger to be right, in the way you talk about people who disagree with you, because the easiest thing in the world is to call yourself a child of light. The harder thing is to live like one. The scrolls also warned about corrupt leaders, teachers, and interpreters of the law. Their writers believed that people entrusted with spiritual authority had betrayed that trust. Some of their language is fierce, sometimes even shocking, and historians cannot simply assume every accusation was fair. These texts emerged from bitter conflicts. They were written by people with enemies, fears, loyalties, and blind spots of their own. But the core warning is still worth hearing. Authority is not proof of truth. Position is not proof of character. A title cannot make a lie holy. And no institution, government, church, movement, or public figure should be beyond moral examination simply because they claim to speak for something greater than themselves. The fifth warning was about wealth, violence, and moral collapse. The ancient authors saw a world where the powerful seemed protected, where injustice could be profitable, where violence and greed appeared to have the upper hand. They looked around and saw people benefiting from systems that harmed others. They saw moral compromise becoming normal, and they refused to call that normal. That is something every generation needs. Not panic, not despair, not the fantasy that the past was pure and only the present is corrupt, but moral clarity. The ability to look at cruelty and call it cruelty, even when it is popular. The ability to look at greed and call it greed, even when it is rewarded. The ability to remember that a society can become very advanced, very wealthy, very connected, and still lose its soul. Then there was the warning about false interpretation. This may be one of the most uncomfortable warnings of all. The Qumran community cared intensely about sacred law. They studied it, debated it, organized their lives around it, and believed many others had twisted it for selfish purposes. But their story shows the danger on both sides. sacred teachings can be ignored, and sacred teachings can be used as weapons. People can reject truth because it demands too much of them. But people can also claim to defend truth while using it to control, shame, exclude, and condemn. That is why knowledge alone is never enough. You can know the text and miss its meaning. You can defend the rule and forget mercy. You can speak constantly about righteousness while becoming less honest, less humble, and less compassionate every day. The final warning was simple. Prepare before the day of visitation. Prepare before the crisis. Prepare before the consequences arrive. Because when pressure comes, it rarely creates character out of nowhere. It reveals the character that has been forming all along. A person does not suddenly become courageous on the day. Courage is required. Usually they have been practicing courage in smaller moments for years. A person does not suddenly become truthful when telling the truth becomes costly. They have been practicing honesty when nobody was watching. A community does not suddenly become united when disaster strikes. It reveals whether it has spent years building trust, responsibility, sacrifice, and care for one another. That is the warning, and maybe that is also the hope. Because if preparation begins before the day of testing, then change can begin now. Not in some distant future. Not after the next election, the next crisis, the next scandal, the next war, the next economic collapse, or the next headline that makes everyone wonder whether the world is falling apart. Now, in the way you speak, in the things you support, in the habits you refuse to excuse, in the people you choose to become when no one is rewarding you for it. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived because a community placed them in jars near the Dead Sea, and, for reasons we still debate, left them hidden in caves for nearly 2,000 years. Empires vanished. Armies marched. Cities rose and fell. Religions changed. Nations were born. And then these voices from an ancient wilderness were uncovered again. They do not speak with one voice. The scrolls are a collection of many texts, copied across different times and communities. Not every manuscript is sectarian, not every warning belongs to the same author, and we should be cautious whenever anyone claims the scrolls predict modern events with perfect precision. But they still confront us. They confront our confidence. They confront our appetite for certainty. They confront the comforting belief that the problem is always somewhere else. Maybe the final generation is not defined by technology, by politics, by a particular year, or by the number of disasters on the news. Maybe it is defined by what happens when people stop listening to warnings because they are too distracted, too angry, too comfortable, or too convinced that warning is meant for someone else. And maybe the opposite is true too. Maybe a generation can become something better when ordinary people choose truth over performance, humility over pride, courage over convenience, and mercy over hatred. That is not a small thing. That is how history changes before anyone notices it changing. If these ancient mysteries are the kind of stories that keep you thinking long after the video ends, take a look at our book on 12 unexplained mysteries, available through the website. The link is in the description. And if this journey through the Dead Sea Scrolls gave you something to think about, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Tell us what warning felt most current to you. Was it the corruption of leaders? The danger of false interpretation? Wealth and violence? The call to prepare before the crisis comes? And tell us where you are listening from. It is always incredible to see how far these ancient voices travel. If you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify. That support makes a real difference, and the Spotify link is in the description. The scrolls leave us with no easy escape. They do not tell us to stare at the sky and wait for history to end. They tell us in their own ancient and urgent way to examine ourselves, to stay awake, to resist the lie when it becomes convenient, to refuse corruption even when corruption seems normal, to prepare before the day arrives when preparation is no longer possible. Because the question is not only whether the final generation will recognize the signs, the question is whether, when the signs appear, it will still have the courage to change.